Have you ever been so wrong about someone that it completely changed your life? Sometimes the person who challenges everything you believe turns out to be exactly what you need. This is what happened when tradition met compassion in the most unexpected way. Dante Torino sat at the head of the mahogany table in Nana's, his family's restaurant in Boston's North End, watching his mother gesture emphatically with her wine glass. At 34, he commanded respect from every corner of the city's underworld, but Isabella Torino still had the power to make him feel like a scolded child. Our family has traditions, Dante. Standards, she said, her Italian accent still thick after 40 years in America. Your father, God rest his soul, he married a good Italian girl, as did his father before him. This is how we preserve what we are. Dante nodded, only half listening as he scanned the restaurant's dining room through habit. Even here, surrounded by the familiar warmth of red checkered tablecloths and the scent of garlic and basil, he remained alert. Leading the Torino family meant never truly relaxing, never completely dropping his guard. The weight of his father's legacy, the responsibility for dozens of men and their families, the constant threat from rival organizations, it all rested on his shoulders. His sister Sophia laughed from across the table, her dark eyes sparkling with mischief. You make it sound so serious, Ma. Maybe Dante wants to fall in love first, then worry about preserving traditions. Love, Isabella scoffed. Love comes after respect, after compatibility, after knowing a woman understands our way of life. These American girls, they don't understand sacrifice. They don't understand loyalty. They want careers and independence, and who knows what else. Dante took a sip of his wine, considering his mother's words. She wasn't entirely wrong. The women he dated over the years had all struggled with his lifestyle, his responsibilities, the demands of his world. They wanted him to be someone else, someone safer, someone who could give them a normal life with normal worries. But he wasn't normal, and he never would be. I'm not looking for just anyone, he said finally. When I marry, it will be to someone who understands what it means to be a Torino wife. Someone who respects our traditions, our heritage. Someone Italian, who was raised with the same values we hold dear. Isabella beamed at him, reaching across the table to pat his hand. This is what I want to hear. Mrs. Benedetto, she has a lovely daughter. Recently divorced, but no children. She works at her father's bakery, very traditional, very sweet. Dante suppressed a grimace. He'd met Carla Benedetto at several family gatherings. Sweet, yes. Traditional, certainly. But there had been no spark, no fire, nothing that made him want to know more about her thoughts or dreams or fears. Still, he nodded politely. I'm sure she's very nice, Ma. Nice is good, Sophia interjected with a grin. But don't you want someone who makes your heart race? Someone who challenges you? Dante's Lieutenant Marco appeared at his elbow, leaning down to whisper something urgent in his ear. The Romano family wanted a meeting. Tonight. They'd been circling for months, testing boundaries, pushing against Torino territory in small but significant ways. Vincent Romano was ambitious and stupid, a dangerous combination that Dante had been watching carefully. I have to go, he told his family, standing and adjusting his suit jacket. Business calls. Always business, Isabella sighed. But you think about what I said, yes? About settling down, about finding a good Italian girl who can give me grandchildren. I will, Ma. He kissed her cheek, inhaling the familiar scent of her perfume, then embraced Sophia. Be careful, she whispered. I don't trust Vincent Romano. Neither do I, he assured her. Which is why I'm bringing backup. The meeting was set for Antonio's, a neutral restaurant owned by the Calabrese family, who maintained careful relationships with all the major players in Boston's organized crime landscape. Dante arrived with Marco and two of his most trusted men, Tommy and Sal, all of them armed and alert despite the public setting. Vincent Romano was already seated when they arrived, flanked by his own security detail. At 42, Vincent had the lean, hungry look of a man who'd fought for everything he'd ever gotten. His dark hair was slicked back, his suit expensive, but somehow still managed to look cheap on his frame. There was an aggressiveness in his posture, a barely contained violence that put Dante's instincts on high alert. Dante, Vincent stood as they approached, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Thanks for meeting with me. They shook hands briefly, both men assessing the other's grip, the steadiness of their gaze, the subtle signs that would indicate strength or weakness. Dante had been playing this game since he was 22 and inherited control of his father's organization. He'd learned to read men like books, to spot lies and threats and opportunities with equal precision. The conversation started cordially enough, discussing territory boundaries and mutual respect, but it quickly became clear that Vincent wanted more than he was entitled to. He wanted access to the waterfront shipping routes that had been Torino-controlled for 3 generations. He wanted a percentage of their protection arrangements in the financial district. Most dangerously, he wanted Dante to acknowledge Romano authority in areas where Torino blood had been spilled to establish dominance. "You're asking for things that aren't mine to give," Dante said calmly, cutting into his steak with deliberate precision. "These arrangements go back decades. They're not up for renegotiation. Everything's up for renegotiation if you're smart enough to see the changing landscape," Vincent replied, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Times are changing, Dante. The old ways, the old families, they're becoming dinosaurs. Smart men adapt. Smart men honor their commitments," Dante countered. "They respect what came before and build on it rather than tearing it down." The tension at the table was palpable now, both security details shifting almost imperceptibly, hands moving closer to concealed weapons. Marco's fingers drummed once against the white tablecloth, a subtle signal that he was ready to move. "That's the difference between us," Vincent said, leaning forward slightly. "You're stuck in the past, thinking tradition will protect you. I'm focused on the future." The shot came from nowhere and everywhere at once, the crack of gunfire splitting the air as the restaurant's front window exploded inward. Dante's instincts, honed by years of survival, kicked in immediately. He threw himself sideways, overturning the table as chaos erupted around them. More gunfire, screams, the crash of breaking glass and overturning chairs. Dante felt something hot and sharp slam into his chest, spinning him around as his vision blurred. He hit the floor hard, tasting blood, his breathing suddenly ragged and painful. Through the haze of shock and adrenaline, he saw Marco dragging him toward the kitchen exit, saw Tommy and Sal returning fire at muzzle flashes in the darkness beyond the shattered windows. Vincent Romano was nowhere to be seen, probably escaped through the back or maybe dead in the carnage. "Boss, stay with me," Marco was saying, his voice tight with worry. "We're getting you out of here. Hospital's 5 minutes away." Dante tried to respond, but couldn't find his voice. The pain in his chest was spreading, a burning agony that made it hard to think, hard to focus on anything except the growing darkness at the edges of his vision. He could feel his life leaking out of him with each labored breath, could feel the strength leaving his body as Marco and Tommy carried him toward the car. The last thing he remembered before unconsciousness took him was the wail of sirens in the distance and the desperate sound of Marco shouting directions to the emergency room at Boston Medical Center. Zara Williams had been a trauma nurse for 6 years, but she still felt her heart rate spike when the emergency alarms sounded through the hospital corridors. Multiple gunshot wounds incoming, the dispatcher's voice crackled over the intercom. ETA 3 minutes. She was already moving, her hands automatically checking supplies, ensuring the trauma bay was ready, calling for the surgical team to be on standby. At 28, Zara had seen enough violence come through these doors to know that the next few minutes would determine whether someone lived or died. The responsibility never got easier, but she'd learned to channel her anxiety into focused action. The ambulance doors burst open and the paramedics rushed in a stretcher carrying a man in an expensive suit soaked with blood. Late 30s, single gunshot wound to the chest, vitals dropping fast. The paramedic rattled off the statistics that would guide her treatment as they transferred him to the trauma table. Zara's hands moved with practiced efficiency, cutting away the blood-soaked shirt to expose the wound, applying pressure to slow the bleeding while she assessed the damage. The bullet had entered just below his left collarbone, and from the angle and the amount of blood, she suspected it had nicked the subclavian artery. "This one's going to need surgery immediately," she called out to Dr. Patterson, the attending physician. "But first we need to stabilize him." She worked quickly, establishing for access, pushing fluids and blood products to maintain his pressure, monitoring his oxygen saturation as his breathing became more labored. His skin was pale and cool to the touch, classic signs of hypovolemic shock, but his pulse, while rapid, was still strong enough to give her hope. The man's eyes fluttered open briefly as she worked, and she found herself looking into the most striking gray-green eyes she'd ever seen. Even clouded with pain and medication, there was an intensity there, an intelligence that suggested he was fighting to stay conscious, fighting to maintain control even as his body betrayed him. "You're going to be okay," she told him, her voice calm and professional despite the chaos around them. "We're taking good care of you. Just try to stay still for me." He tried to speak, but couldn't manage more than a hoarse whisper. She leaned closer to hear him, catching the faint scent of expensive cologne beneath the metallic smell of blood. "My family," he managed. "Need to call. We'll take care of everything," she assured him. "Right now, you need to focus on breathing and letting us help you." The surgical team arrived, and they moved him quickly toward the operating room. As Zara watched the stretcher disappear through the double doors, she realized she was shaking slightly. There had been something about this patient, something that had gotten under her professional reserve in a way that rarely happened anymore. She spent the next 3 hours assisting in surgery, helping Dr. Patterson repair the damaged artery and remove the bullet that had come within millimeters of causing fatal damage. The man there, John Doe, since he'd arrived without identification, fought through every moment of the procedure, his vital signs showing a strength and resilience that impressed everyone in the OR. It was nearly 2 in the morning when he was finally stable enough to move to the ICU. Zara volunteered to take the first monitoring shift, telling herself it was because she'd been there from the beginning and understood his case better than anyone else. But if she was being honest, she couldn't shake the image of those gray-green eyes, the way he'd tried to maintain control even as he was dying. She was checking his drainage tubes when his family arrived. 3 people in expensive clothes who moved with the kind of authority that suggested they were used to being in charge. An older woman who was clearly his mother, with silver-streaked dark hair and worried eyes. A younger woman who shared his strong jawline and olive complexion. And a man about her patient's age who carried himself like a soldier or a bodyguard. "Is he going to be okay?" the older woman asked, her accent marking her as Italian. "Please, I need to know if my son is going to live." "He's stable," Zara assured her. "The surgery went well. The bullet damaged an artery, but we were able to repair it. He'll need to stay here for several days, and recovery will take weeks, but he should make a full recovery." The relief in the room was palpable. The younger woman sank into a chair, covering her face with her hands, while the older woman crossed herself and whispered what sounded like a prayer in Italian. The man who'd come with them, clearly some kind of security or assistant, stepped closer to Zara. "What does he need?" he asked quietly. "What kind of care?" "Complete rest for the next 48 hours, Zara explained. "After that, we'll start getting him up and moving gradually. Pain management, respiratory therapy to prevent pneumonia, monitoring for infection. He's going to need a lot of help for the next few weeks." "Whatever he needs," the older woman said firmly. "Money is no object. The best care, the best doctors, whatever it takes." Zara nodded, making notes in his chart. "We'll take excellent care of him, I promise." As she left them to their reunion, Zara found herself wondering about this man and his family. There was something about them that felt different from the usual shooting victims who came through the emergency room. The expensive clothes, the way they carried themselves, the casual mention of money being no object at all suggested wealth and power that went beyond what most people possessed. But more than that, there had been something in his eyes during those brief moments of consciousness, something that made her think he was someone accustomed to being in control, someone who commanded respect and perhaps even fear. She'd treated enough criminals over the years to recognize the type, but there had been something else there too, something that had made her want to reassure him, to ease his worry about his family. As she finally headed home as the sun was rising, Zara couldn't shake the feeling that this patient was going to be different from all the others. Something about the way he'd looked at her, the intensity even through the pain and medication, suggested that their paths would cross again in ways that had nothing to do with medical care. She had no idea how right she was. Dante woke to the steady beeping of monitors and the antiseptic smell of hospital air. His chest felt like someone had set fire to it, and every breath sent sharp jolts of pain through his torso. But he was alive, and in his world, that counted as a victory. The first thing he saw was his mother sitting beside his bed, her rosary beads clicking softly between her fingers. Isabella looked older than her 62 years, worry lines etched deep around her dark eyes. When she noticed he was awake, relief flooded her features. "Dante, grazie a Dio," she whispered, reaching for his hand. "I thought I was going to lose you like I lost your father." He tried to speak, but his throat felt raw and dry. A movement near the window caught his attention, and he saw Marco stationed there like a sentinel, his sharp eyes scanning the parking lot below. Even here, surrounded by doctors and nurses, his lieutenant remained on guard. "The nurse will want to know you're awake," Sophia said from the other side of the bed. "She's been checking on you every hour, making sure everything is stable." As if summoned by his sister's words, the door opened, and the woman from his fragmented memories walked in. Zara Williams, according to the name tag pinned to her navy blue scrubs. She was even more beautiful than he'd remembered through the haze of trauma and medication. Rich brown skin that seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights, intelligent dark eyes that missed nothing, and natural hair pulled back in a way that framed her face perfectly. "Good morning, Mr. Torino," she said, her voice warm but professional. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been shot," he managed, surprised by how hoarse his voice sounded. "That's to be expected," she replied with a small smile that transformed her entire face. The bullet did significant damage, but Dr. Patterson was able to repair everything. "You're going to have some pain for a while, but you should make a complete recovery." She moved around his bed with practiced efficiency, checking his 4 lines, monitoring his drainage tubes, listening to his breathing with her stethoscope. Dante found himself watching her hands as she worked, noting how gentle but confident her touch was, how she seemed to anticipate his discomfort and adjust her movements accordingly. "Your family has been here all night," she continued, making notes on his chart. "They're very worried about you." Isabella leaned forward, her accent thick with emotion. "This nurse, she saved your life. The doctor said if she hadn't worked so fast, if she hadn't known exactly what to do, you would have died before surgery." Dante's eyes found Zara's again, seeing a slight flush color her cheeks at his mother's praise. "Thank you," he said simply, meaning it more than he'd meant anything in years. "I was just doing my job," she replied, but there was something in her expression that suggested it had been more than routine for her too. Isabella stood suddenly, moving to Zara's side with the kind of purpose that made both Dante and Sophia exchange worried glances. Their mother in full Italian grandmother mode was a force of nature that few could resist. "You have children?" Isabella asked, studying Zara with keen eyes. "I have a daughter," Zara answered carefully. "She's 4. 4, Isabella repeated, her voice softening. "A beautiful age. And her father?" Something flickered across Zara's face, too quick for Dante to interpret fully, but he caught the slight tightening around her eyes, the way her shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly. "It's just the 2 of us," she said quietly. "Ma," Sophia interrupted gently. "Maybe we should let Nurse Williams do her job." "Of course," Isabella agreed, but Dante could see the wheels turning in his mother's mind. She'd always been a matchmaker at heart, and he had the unsettling feeling that she was already weaving scenarios that involved grandchildren and Sunday dinners. Over the next 2 days, Zara became a constant presence in Dante's recovery. She administered his pain medications with a precision that kept him comfortable without making him feel helpless. She helped him with the breathing exercises designed to prevent pneumonia, her hands steady on his back as she guided him through each repetition. She monitored his incision site with a clinical thoroughness that somehow never felt impersonal. What Dante hadn't expected was how much he began to look forward to her visits. Not just because she provided relief from pain or because her medical knowledge was clearly extensive, but because there was something about her presence that calmed the restless energy that always lived in his chest. She didn't flinch when Marco spoke in the rapid Italian they used for sensitive business discussions. She didn't ask probing questions about the circumstances of his shooting. She simply cared for him with a competence and compassion that he found both unfamiliar and addictive. On his 3rd night in the hospital, Dante couldn't sleep. The pain medication made him drowsy but didn't quiet his mind, which kept cycling through the implications of the assassination attempt. Vincent Romano had clearly decided that negotiation was pointless, that eliminating Dante was the fastest path to Torino territory. It was a declaration of war, and Dante needed to be strong enough to respond appropriately. He was staring at the ceiling when Zara appeared in his doorway, her footsteps silent on the hospital linoleum. She'd changed out of her scrubs into jeans and a soft sweater that made her look younger, more approachable. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly, stepping into the room. "Too much to think about," he admitted. She moved to check his monitors, even though they both knew it wasn't necessary. Her shift had ended hours ago. She was here by choice, not obligation. "Want to talk about it?" she offered, settling into the chair beside his bed. Dante studied her face in the dim light from the hallway. There was genuine concern there, not the calculated interest he was used to from people who wanted something from him. It had been so long since anyone had asked about his thoughts rather than his orders that he found himself considering her offer seriously. "My business involves a lot of complicated relationships," he said finally. "Sometimes those complications turn violent." "I gathered that from the gunshot wound," she replied with a wry smile. "But you don't seem like someone who goes looking for trouble." "Trouble has a way of finding me regardless," he said. "It's the price of being responsible for other people, for protecting what my family built." Zara was quiet for a long moment, and he wondered if he'd said too much, revealed more than he should have. But when she spoke, her voice was thoughtful rather than judgmental. "My ex used to say that his anger was just part of protecting me," she said quietly. "That the violence was necessary, that I wouldn't understand because I wasn't strong enough to handle the real world." Dante felt something cold settle in his stomach. There was a careful neutrality in her tone that spoke of old wounds, of trauma she'd learned to carry without letting it break her. "That's not protection," he said, his voice harder than he'd intended. "That's control. They're not the same thing." She looked at him with surprise, as if she hadn't expected him to understand the distinction. "No, they're not," she agreed. "It took me a long time to learn that." "How long ago?" he found himself asking. 2 years, she said. "That's when I left Detroit, came here to start over. Amara was barely 2, and I knew I had to get her somewhere safe." The courage that must have taken, leaving everything familiar with a toddler in tow, struck him silent. In his world, strength was measured by how much power you could accumulate, how much fear you could inspire. But sitting here in the dark with this woman who'd rebuilt her entire life to protect her child, Dante realized there were different kinds of strength entirely. "You're braver than most soldiers I know," he told her honestly. "I'm just a mother who wanted better for her daughter," she replied. But he caught the way her shoulders straightened slightly at his words, as if she wasn't used to having her strength acknowledged. Their conversation was interrupted by Marco appearing in the doorway, his posture alert and professional. "Boss, sorry to interrupt, but we need to discuss security arrangements for when you're discharged," he said. Dante watched Zara's expression change as she processed the deference in Marco's voice, the way he positioned himself between Dante's bed and the door, the subtle bulge under his jacket that suggested he was armed. He saw the exact moment when she realized that whatever business Dante was in, it was far more dangerous than she'd imagined. "I should let you handle your business," she said, starting to stand. "Stay," Dante said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. "Please." She hesitated, then settled back into her chair, though he could see the wariness that had crept into her posture. "What's the situation?" Dante asked Marco. "Vincent Romano is claiming the hit was retaliation for alleged interference in Romano operations," Marco reported. "He's trying to frame it as justified response rather than unprovoked aggression. But our sources say he's planning to move on our waterfront contracts while you're recovering." Dante's jaw tightened. He'd expected as much. Vincent was opportunistic enough to use Dante's temporary weakness as a chance to grab what he'd been denied through negotiation. "Double the security on all our facilities," he ordered, "and I want surveillance on every Romano property. If they so much as breathe wrong, I want to know about it." "What about here?" Marco asked, glancing meaningfully around the hospital room. "Maintain the current detail until I'm discharged, then we'll reassess based on my recovery timeline," Dante replied. As Marco left to implement his orders, Dante became acutely aware of Zara's silence beside him. When he looked at her, he saw a mixture of understanding and concern that made his chest tighten in ways that had nothing to do with his injuries. "You're not just a businessman," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. "No," he admitted. "I'm not." She nodded slowly, as if confirming something she'd already suspected. "Your family, they're organized crime." "My family has been in Boston for 4 generations," he said carefully. "We have legitimate businesses, but we also handle problems that the police can't or won't deal with. We protect our neighborhood, take care of our people. And the man who shot you wants what we have and thinks violence is the fastest way to get it, Dante replied. Zara was quiet for so long that he began to worry she was going to ask for a different patient assignment, that the reality of his world would be too much for her to accept. But when she finally spoke, her voice was steady. I've seen enough violence to know that some people cause it, and some people try to stop it, she said. The question is which one you are. The faith in her voice, the willingness to judge him by his actions rather than his reputation, was more intoxicating than any pain medication. Looking at her in the soft hospital lighting, seeing the intelligence and compassion in her dark eyes, Dante realized that something fundamental had shifted in his chest. Not just attraction, though God knew that was there too, but something deeper. Something that made him want to be worthy of the trust she was offering. I try to stop it, he said, meaning it more than he'd ever meant anything. At least for the people I care about. She smiled then, the first real smile she'd given him, and Dante felt something he'd thought was dead in him spark back to life. Hope. The crazy, impossible hope that maybe, just maybe, he'd found someone who could see past what he was to who he wanted to be. Dr. Patterson frowned as he reviewed Dante's discharge paperwork, his pen hovering over the signature line. The surgery was successful, but you're going to need substantial care for the next 2 weeks, he told Dante. Daily wound monitoring, pain management, assistance with mobility. I'd prefer to keep you here another few days. Dante shifted uncomfortably in the hospital bed, his jaw set in the stubborn line that Sophia recognized from childhood arguments. I need to be home, he said firmly. My business can't run itself. Then you'll need private nursing care, Dr. Patterson insisted. Someone with trauma experience who can monitor for complications. If that incision becomes infected, if you develop pneumonia from limited mobility, we could be looking at a much more serious situation. Isabella immediately began calculating logistics, her mind already spinning through possibilities. We can hire the best private nurses in Boston, she declared. Money is no concern. Actually, Dr. Patterson said thoughtfully, your primary nurse here would be perfect for the job. Zara Williams has extensive trauma experience, and she's already familiar with your case. Dante felt his pulse quicken at the suggestion, though he told himself it was purely practical. Zara had been competent and professional throughout his stay. The fact that he found himself looking forward to her visits, that her presence somehow made the sterile hospital room feel warmer, was irrelevant to the medical decision. When Zara arrived for her shift an hour later, Dr. Patterson presented the private duty offer. 2 weeks of home nursing care, monitoring a post-surgical patient with trauma injuries. The pay was generous, more than she'd make in a month of hospital shifts. I appreciate the offer, she said carefully, but I have obligations here at the hospital, and I have a daughter to consider. What she didn't say, what she couldn't say in front of these wealthy people who saw money as the solution to every problem, was that taking a private duty job meant losing her benefits, her job security, the stability she'd worked so hard to build after fleeing Detroit with nothing but a diaper bag, and her determination to create a better life for Amara. Isabella leaned forward with the intensity that had convinced countless neighborhood mothers to send their children to church on Sundays. Your daughter, she could come with you during the day, no? Our home has plenty of space, a lovely garden where she could play safely. Zara's breath caught. The casual mention of space and safety hit her exactly where she was most vulnerable. Amara's current daycare was adequate but crowded, the playground surrounded by city streets that made Zara nervous every time she dropped off her daughter. The idea of Amara having room to run, to play without worrying about traffic or strangers, was almost impossible to resist. The financial pressure was equally compelling. Her student loans from nursing school were a constant weight, and Amara needed new clothes for the fall, had been asking for dance classes that Zara couldn't afford. 2 weeks of private duty pay would cover expenses that had been keeping her awake at night. I need to think about it, she said finally. Take your time, Dante said, his gray-green eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her pulse skip. But I hope you'll consider it. I trust you. There was something in the way he said trust that made her believe he didn't offer it lightly. In her experience, men with power rarely acknowledged dependence on anyone, especially women. But Dante seemed genuinely grateful for her care, genuinely concerned about his recovery rather than his image. That evening, after her shift ended and she'd picked up Amara from daycare, Zara found herself staring at her bank account balance and trying to make numbers work that simply wouldn't cooperate. Rent, utilities, groceries, daycare, student loans, even with her nursing salary, there was never enough left over for the extras that would make Amara's childhood richer. "Mama, can I take dance classes like Emma?" Amara asked over their dinner of pasta and frozen vegetables, her dark eyes hopeful. "Maybe soon, baby," Zara replied, hating herself for the false promise. "But we need to save up a little more first." That night, after Amara was asleep, Zara called Dr. Patterson and accepted the private duty assignment. Dante's penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a converted warehouse in the North End, all exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered spectacular views of Boston Harbor. When Zara stepped off the private elevator with Amara's hand clasped tightly in hers, she felt her daughter's grip tighten with the same overwhelmed awe she was trying to hide. The space was massive, easily 4 times the size of their cramped apartment, furnished with pieces that looked like they belonged in a museum. Rich leather sofas arranged around a fireplace that could heat their entire building. A kitchen with professional-grade appliances and marble countertops that gleamed under carefully positioned lighting. Abstract paintings that probably cost more than Zara made in a year. "Wow," Amara whispered, her voice echoing slightly in the open space. "It's like a castle." A woman appeared from what looked like a library, middle-aged with graying hair pulled into a neat bun and wearing an apron over conservative dress clothes. "You must be Nurse Williams," she said warmly. "I'm Margaret, Mr. Torino's housekeeper. He's waiting for you in the main bedroom." Amara pressed closer to Zara's leg, suddenly shy in this grand space with its unfamiliar luxuries. Margaret noticed immediately, crouching down to Amara's eye level with practiced ease. "And you must be the little princess I've been hearing about," she said kindly. "Would you like to see the garden while your mama takes care of Mr. Torino? I think there might be some cookies that need testing." Amara looked up at Zara questioningly. "It's okay, baby," Zara assured her. "I'll come find you in a few minutes." As Margaret led Amara toward the terrace doors, Zara made her way through the penthouse to the master suite, noting the subtle but unmistakable signs of serious security. Cameras positioned at strategic angles, reinforced doors, windows that looked like they'd been designed to stop more than just weather. Whatever business Dante was really in, he clearly lived with the constant awareness that someone might try to hurt him. She found him propped up in a massive bed that dominated one wall of the bedroom, his laptop balanced carefully on his knees as he typed with obvious frustration. The effort of holding his arms up was clearly taxing his injured chest, but his expression suggested he wouldn't admit weakness even to himself. "You shouldn't be straining yourself like that," she said, setting down her medical bag and moving to check his vitals. "I have work that can't wait," he replied, but he closed the laptop and submitted to her examination without further protest. His color was good, his breathing steady, and the incision site showed no signs of infection. But she could see the exhaustion around his eyes, the way he favored his injured side, even while trying to hide it. "Your body needs rest to heal," she told him as she checked his drainage tubes. "Pushing yourself too hard could set back your recovery by weeks." "There are things that require my attention," he said. "People depending on me to make decisions. And they'll still depend on you if you're healthy," she countered. "But not if you end up back in the hospital with complications." Something in her tone must have gotten through to him, because he actually smiled, the expression transforming his entire face from intimidating to almost boyish. "You don't intimidate easily, do you?" "Not when it comes to my patient's health," she replied. "In this room, my word is law." The respect in his eyes as he looked at her was different from anything she'd experienced with other men. Not the calculating interest of someone who saw her as a potential conquest, not the dismissive tolerance she'd endured from Devon, but genuine appreciation for her competence and strength. Their moment was interrupted by Marco's arrival, his expression tense as he knocked on the bedroom door. "Boss, sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation." Zara started to leave to give them privacy, but Dante gestured for her to stay. "She's part of the household now," he said to Marco. "She might as well understand what she's gotten herself into." Marco glanced at her uncertainly, then back at Dante. "Vincent Romano hit our shipping operation this morning. 3 of our guys in the hospital, 2 trucks destroyed, 250,000 in merchandise stolen. Dante's expression went completely cold, and Zara felt a chill run down her spine as she glimpsed the man who commanded fear from Boston's criminal underworld. The transformation was complete and terrifying. All traces of the patient she'd been caring for replaced by someone who clearly didn't hesitate to use violence when necessary. Retaliation? He asked, his voice deadly quiet. Already in motion, Marco replied. Tommy's coordinating with the other families to make sure they know this was unprovoked aggression. We should have locations on Romano's people within the hour. Do it, Dante ordered. But I want Vincent taken alive. I need to send a message about what happens when someone thinks I'm weak. As Marco left to carry out his orders, Zara found herself staring at Dante with new understanding. This wasn't just a businessman with complicated relationships. This was someone who commanded an organization capable of significant violence, someone whose decisions affected life and death for dozens of people. You're scared, he observed, watching her face carefully. She considered lying, but something about his direct gaze made dishonesty feel pointless. Yes, she admitted. I've seen enough violence to know how quickly it escalates. I would never let anything happen to you or Amara, he said with quiet intensity. You're under my protection now. The certainty in his voice should have been reassuring, but instead it highlighted how completely she'd entered a world she didn't understand. Protection implied threat, and the casual way he spoke about retaliation suggested that violence was as natural to him as breathing. That night, after Amara had fallen asleep in the guest room that was larger than their entire apartment, Zara sat beside Dante's bed reviewing his medication schedule. He'd been unusually quiet since the afternoon's crisis, his attention divided between business calls and the laptop he'd promised not to overuse. You're wondering what you've gotten yourself into, he said suddenly. The question is whether I should be, she replied honestly. Dante was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on the expensive bedding. What was his name? He asked finally. Whose name? Your ex. The one who hurt you. Zara felt her throat tighten. Devin, she said quietly. Devin Matthews. Tell me about him. She'd never talked about Devin with anyone, not even the therapist the domestic violence shelter had recommended. But something about the darkness of the room, the quiet intimacy of caring for someone vulnerable, made the words come easier than they ever had before. He was charming at first, she began. Successful, confident, made me feel special. But he needed to control everything: what I wore, where I went, who I talked to. When I started to pull away, when I realized how isolated I'd become, that's when he got violent. Dante's hands clenched into fists, and she could see the effort it took him to keep his voice level. How long? Almost 2 years, she admitted. I kept thinking I could fix it, that if I just tried harder, if I could be what he wanted, he'd go back to being the man I fell in love with. But he never did. No, she said. He just got worse. More possessive, more violent. When I got pregnant with Amara, I thought maybe that would change things. Instead, it made him more controlling. He said I belonged to him now, that the baby proved it. The silence that followed was heavy with Dante's barely contained rage. When he finally spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. Where is he now? Detroit, as far as I know, she said. I got a restraining order before we left, but I don't know if he's tried to find us. I change my phone number every few months, use cash whenever possible. I've been careful. Not careful enough, apparently, Dante said grimly. If I can find someone in Detroit with a few phone calls, so can he. The casual confidence with which he spoke about locating people who didn't want to be found sent another chill through her. What are you saying? I'm saying that running and hiding might have worked for 2 years, but it's not a permanent solution, he replied. Men like that don't give up. They wait for opportunities. You don't know him, she protested, though even as she said it, she felt the truth of his words settling in her stomach like lead. I know men who think they own women, Dante said quietly. I've dealt with them before. They don't stop until someone makes them stop. The implications of what he was suggesting hung in the air between them. Zara had spent 2 years building a life based on invisibility, on staying beneath notice, on hoping that distance and time would be enough to keep her and Amara safe. But looking at Dante's expression, seeing the cold certainty in his eyes, she realized that safety might require a different kind of protection entirely. I can't ask you to, she began. You're not asking, he interrupted. You're here, in my home, caring for my family. That makes you my responsibility. The possessiveness in his voice should have frightened her, should have triggered every alarm bell that Devon had installed in her psyche. But instead of feeling trapped, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, truly safe. Not just physically protected, but valued, cared for by someone who had the power to follow through on his promises. When nightmares woke him 3 hours later, Dante found Zara dozing in the chair beside his bed, her head tilted at an angle that would give her a painful crick in the morning. He'd been dreaming about the shooting, about bleeding out on Antonio's floor, while Vincent Romano stood over him laughing. But as the terror faded and his breathing steadied, what remained wasn't fear, but rage at the thought of anyone hurting the woman sleeping beside him. "Zara," he called softly. She woke immediately, the instant alertness of someone accustomed to emergencies. "Are you in pain? Do you need medication?" "No," he said. "Just dreams." She stood and moved to check his pulse anyway, her fingers gentle against his wrist. As she leaned over him, he caught the scent of her shampoo, something light and floral that made him think of gardens rather than hospitals. When she would have pulled away, he caught her hand in his. "Zara," he said quietly. She looked down at him, and in the dim light from the hallway, he could see uncertainty and something deeper in her dark eyes. Something that matched the growing need in his chest. The certainty that whatever was happening between them was bigger than attraction, more dangerous than desire. "This is complicated," she whispered. "Everything worth having is complicated," he replied. When he drew her down to him, she didn't resist. When his lips met hers, she sighed against his mouth, like someone who'd been holding her breath for years. The kiss was gentle at first, careful of his injuries and her fears, but when she deepened it, when her hand came up to cup his cheek with infinite tenderness, Dante felt something in his chest that had nothing to do with bullet wounds and everything to do with hope. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing unsteadily, Zara rested her forehead against his. "This is crazy," she said softly. "Probably," he agreed. "But I've never been good at playing it safe." Neither was she, apparently, because when he kissed her again, she kissed him back like she was drowning and he was air. The morning after their first kiss, Zara woke in the guest room with a confusion of emotions tangled in her chest. Sunlight streamed through windows that faced east over the harbor, and she could hear Amara's delighted laughter echoing from somewhere in the penthouse. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to wake up like this every day, in a place where her daughter could laugh freely and she didn't have to worry about making rent. She found Amara in the kitchen with Dante, who was seated at the marble island with his laptop carefully positioned to avoid strain on his healing chest. Amara had climbed onto the stool beside him and was chattering animatedly about the cookies Margaret had promised to teach her to make. "And then we put chocolate chips, lots and lots of them," Amara was saying, her small hands gesturing dramatically. "Margaret says I can help measure everything." "That sounds delicious," Dante replied, and Zara was struck by how natural he sounded, how genuinely interested he seemed in her daughter's excitement about baking. When Amara noticed Zara in the doorway, she jumped down from her stool and ran over. "Mama, Dante has a really big TV and Margaret says we can watch movies after we make cookies, and he has books with pictures of castles just like this place." "Slow down, baby," Zara laughed, smoothing Amara's hair. "Did you say good morning to Mr. Torino?" Amara nodded solemnly, then looked up at Dante with the kind of direct curiosity that only children possessed. "Are you going to marry my mama?" she asked. Zara felt heat flood her cheeks. "Amara, sweetie, that's not something you ask people." But Dante didn't seem embarrassed. Instead, he looked at Amara with complete seriousness, as if her question deserved thoughtful consideration. "Your mama is a very special woman," he said carefully, "and you're a very special little girl. I'd be lucky if either of you wanted me around." Amara considered this, then nodded as if his answer satisfied some internal criteria she'd been evaluating. "You can stay," she decided magnanimously. "But you have to be nice to Mama always." "Always," Dante promised, his eyes finding Zara's across the kitchen. Later that morning, while Amara was absorbed in coloring books that Margaret had produced from some seemingly endless supply of child-friendly activities, Zara checked Dante's incision and found it healing better than expected. His color was good, his mobility improving daily, and most importantly, he seemed to be following her instructions about rest without the stubborn resistance she'd expected. "You're recovering well," she told him as she re-bandaged the wound. "But I'm still concerned about your stress levels. Running a business from bed isn't exactly restful." "Some things can't be delegated," he replied, but there was less tension in his voice than there had been the previous day. "Maybe not, but you need to trust your people to handle more than you're comfortable with," she said. "Stress slows healing, and right now healing needs to be your priority." He caught her hand as she finished with the bandage, his thumb stroking gently across her knuckles. "Is that your professional opinion, nurse?" The heat in his eyes made her pulse skip, but she forced herself to maintain some semblance of professional distance. "It is," she said, though her voice came out breathier than she'd intended. The spell was broken by Marco's arrival with updates on the Romano situation. Dante reluctantly released her hand, but she noticed he didn't ask her to leave this time. "Vincent's getting desperate," Marco reported. "Word is he's borrowed heavily to finance this war, and if he doesn't show results soon, his own people might decide he's more liability than leader." "Good," Dante said grimly. "Desperate men make mistakes." He's also reaching out to families in New York, trying to drum up support for a full-scale takeover attempt, Marco continued. "Claims you're weak, that the Torino name doesn't command the respect it used to." Dante's expression went dangerously cold. "Then maybe it's time to remind everyone exactly what that name means." As Marco left to coordinate their response, Zara felt the familiar chill that came with witnessing Dante's transformation from patient to crime boss. She was beginning to understand that these weren't separate aspects of his personality, but different expressions of the same core nature. Absolute commitment to protecting what he considered his. That afternoon, Isabella arrived for an unscheduled visit that Zara suspected had more to do with curiosity about her son's living arrangements than concern about his health. She brought Sophia and enough food to feed a small army, transforming Dante's minimalist kitchen into something that resembled a bustling family gathering. "You look better," Isabella told Dante after embracing him carefully. "Color in your cheeks again." "Good food and good company," he replied, his eyes finding Zara's across the room. Isabella followed his gaze, then busied herself arranging containers of food with the kind of deliberate activity that suggested she was processing information. When Amara emerged from the library where she'd been exploring, Isabella's entire demeanor softened. "And this must be the beautiful little girl I've been hearing about," she said, crouching down to Amara's level with the ease of someone who'd spent decades charming children. Within minutes, Amara was chattering away in a mixture of English and the few Italian words Isabella was teaching her, completely won over by the kind of focused attention that only Italian grandmothers possessed. Watching them together, Zara felt something twist in her chest that was equal parts hope and terror. "You should come to Sunday dinner this week," Isabella announced during a lull in conversation. "The whole family will be there, and it's important for Dante's recovery that he maintains normal social connections." "Ma," Dante started, but Isabella waved away his protest. "Nonsense," she said. "Zara is part of your care team now, and little Amara needs to meet her extended family." The casual way she said extended family sent a thrill of panic through Zara. This was happening too fast, becoming too real too quickly. A week ago she'd been a single mother struggling to make ends meet, and now she was being invited to family dinners as if she belonged in Dante's world. Sunday dinner at the Torino house was both everything Zara had expected and nothing she could have prepared for. The house itself was a testament to 4 generations of success, all dark wood and rich fabrics and family photographs that told the story of Italian immigrants who'd built an empire through determination and careful strategic thinking. Isabella had clearly spent the week planning the meal around Dante's dietary restrictions and Amara's preferences, creating a menu that managed to be both elegant and child-friendly. The dining room table groaned under the weight of antipasto platters, fresh pasta, roasted vegetables, and desserts that belonged in a magazine. But it was the family dynamics that fascinated Zara most. Cousins and uncles and family friends who treated Dante with obvious respect, but also the kind of comfortable familiarity that suggested genuine affection. Children who climbed on his lap despite his injuries. Relatives who argued politics and business with the passion of people who'd known each other for decades. Amara was absorbed into the chaos with the ease of a child who'd been starved for extended family, passed from lap to lap and fed treats by aunts who competed to spoil her most thoroughly. Watching her daughter laugh and play with cousins she'd just met, Zara felt the walls she'd built around their small family beginning to crack. "You look overwhelmed," Sophia said, settling beside Zara on the terrace where she'd stepped out for air. "It's a lot," Zara admitted. "We've been just the two of us for so long." "It can be intense," Sophia agreed. "But you'll notice they've already claimed you. Look at how Ma is with Amara. That's not politeness. That's love." Through the dining room windows, Zara could see Isabella teaching Amara to fold napkins, their dark heads bent together in concentration. The sight made her throat tight with emotions she couldn't name. "He's different with you," Sophia continued quietly. "Lighter somehow. Like he remembers how to hope again." That evening, after the family had dispersed and Amara had fallen asleep in the car on the way home, Dante helped Zara carry her sleeping daughter up to the guest room. As they stood together in the doorway watching Amara sleep, Zara felt the weight of everything that was changing between them. "She's amazing," Dante said softly. "You've done an incredible job raising her." "I've done the best I could," Zara replied. "But she deserves more than just surviving. She deserves a family who adores her," he said. "People who will protect her and spoil her and make sure she knows she's precious." The certainty in his voice, the way he spoke as if Amara's place in his family was already decided, should have frightened her. Instead, it filled her with a longing so intense it made her chest ache. "Dante," she started, then stopped, not sure how to voice the fears and hopes warring in her heart. He turned to face her, and in the dim light from the hallway, she could see the same mixture of want and uncertainty in his eyes that she felt in her own chest. "I know this is fast," he said quietly. "I know you have every reason to be careful. But I need you to know that what I feel for you, what I'm starting to feel for her, it's not just attraction or convenience. It's real." When he reached for her, she didn't pull away. When he kissed her this time, it was different from the night before, deeper, more desperate, as if they were both drowning and had finally found something solid to hold on to. Their second kiss became a third, then a fourth, until they were moving blindly toward his bedroom, hands reaching for each other with a hunger that had been building since that first night in the hospital. When they finally fell together onto his massive bed, Dante was careful of his injuries but reverent in his touch, treating her body like something precious that he'd been entrusted to worship. What followed was unlike anything Zara had ever experienced. Not the desperate, controlling passion she'd known with Devon, but something tender and consuming that left her feeling cherished rather than taken. Dante's hands mapped every inch of her skin with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world, who found pleasure in her pleasure, who whispered her name like a prayer against her throat. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in sheets that probably cost more than her monthly rent, Zara felt both completely safe and terrifyingly vulnerable. This was what she'd been afraid of, not just the physical intimacy, but the emotional connection that made the thought of leaving feel impossible. "We should talk about what this means," she said softly, her head pillowed on his uninjured shoulder. "It means you're mine now," he replied, his arm tightening around her. "You and Amara both. Whatever comes next, we face it together." The possessiveness in his voice should have set off alarm bells, should have reminded her of all the ways men had tried to own her before. But there was something in Dante's tone that was different, not the need to control, but the need to protect, to provide, to build something lasting. Their peaceful moment was shattered by Dante's phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand. Marco's name flashed on the screen, and Dante's expression immediately shifted into crisis mode. "What is it?" he answered. "Boss, we have a problem." Marco's voice was tight with tension. "That ex of Zara's, Devin Matthews, he's been asking questions at Boston Medical Center. Used some story about being concerned about his daughter's welfare. Got a sympathetic administrator to confirm that Zara Williams works there." Zara felt ice form in her stomach as she listened to the conversation. After 2 years of careful hiding, of staying invisible and hoping distance would be enough, Devin had found her. "How long ago?" Dante asked, his free arms still wrapped protectively around Zara. "Yesterday afternoon," Marco replied. "But boss, there's more. He's not alone. Looks like he hired some kind of private investigator, maybe even some muscle. This isn't just an angry ex looking to cause trouble, he's planning something." As Dante hung up and immediately began making calls to increase security, to put protection details on both Zara and Amara, To activate the network that could track Devon's movements through the city, Zara felt the weight of her past crashing into the fragile hope she'd been building for the future. She'd brought danger into Dante's world, had put him and his family at risk by allowing herself to believe that love might be possible for someone like her. As she watched him transform from lover to protector, coordinating resources with the efficiency of a military commander, she wondered if the price of safety might be too high for both of them to pay. But when he finished his calls and pulled her back into his arms, when he looked at her with eyes that promised retribution against anyone who dared to threaten what was his, Zara realized that she was no longer running. For the first time in her life, she was standing and fighting, and she wasn't doing it alone. The call came at 2:15 on a Tuesday afternoon, while Dante was reviewing shipping manifests and Zara was helping Amara with a puzzle in the living room. Marco's voice was tight with controlled panic when Dante answered. "Boss, they tried to take her," he said without preamble. Dante's blood turned to ice. "Amara?" Devon showed up at the school with some official-looking paperwork claiming parental rights. The teacher got suspicious when Amara started crying and screaming that she didn't know him. Tommy and Sal moved in before he could get her to his car. Dante's vision went red around the edges. Where is she now? Safe house with Isabella and Sophia. But boss, this was coordinated. While Devon was making his move, Vincent Romano's people hit our warehouse on the waterfront. They wanted us distracted. As Dante hung up, Zara appeared in the doorway with Amara in her arms, both of them pale with shock. Margaret had whisked them away from the windows the moment Marco's call came in, following security protocols that Dante hoped would never be necessary. "He tried to take her," Zara whispered, her voice barely audible over Amara's quiet sniffles. At her school, in front of all her friends. Dante moved to them immediately, wrapping both of them in his arms despite the protest from his healing ribs. The feel of Amara's small body trembling against his chest filled him with a rage so pure it was almost religious in its intensity. "He'll never touch either of you again," he promised, his voice deadly quiet. "I swear it on my father's grave." Within an hour, Dante's penthouse had transformed into a command center. Marco coordinated with their contacts at Boston PD to put out a bolo on Devon Matthews and his known associates. Tommy reported that the warehouse attack was a diversion designed to draw their forces away from protecting Zara and Amara. Sal confirmed that Vincent Romano had been seen personally overseeing the operation, suggesting this was his play for a decisive victory. But it was the call from an unknown number that changed everything. "Dante Torino." Vincent Romano's voice was smooth with false courtesy. "I believe you have something that belongs to me, and I have something that belongs to you." Dante's free hand clenched into a fist. "What do you want, Vincent?" "Simple exchange," Vincent replied. "Your waterfront territories, your shipping contracts, and your formal acknowledgement that the Romano family now controls everything south of Commercial Street. In exchange, you get your pretty nurse back unharmed." The bottom dropped out of Dante's world. "When?" "She left your building an hour ago to pick up supplies from the hospital." "My people were waiting," Vincent said, and Dante could hear the smile in his voice. Such a dedicated professional, always thinking of her patients first. Dante's mind raced through the implications. Zara had mentioned needing to collect specialized wound care supplies from Boston Medical, had insisted she could make the quick trip while Amara napped with Margaret. He'd allowed it because she'd seemed stir-crazy from being confined to the penthouse, because he'd thought his security detail would be sufficient protection. He'd been wrong, and now the woman he loved was paying the price for his miscalculation. "You have until midnight to decide," Vincent continued. "The old pier at Castle Island. Come alone, or she dies very slowly." The line went dead, leaving Dante staring at his phone with a mixture of rage and terror that threatened to overwhelm his ability to think strategically. Everything he'd built, everything his family had sacrificed for 4 generations, balanced against the life of a woman who'd become more important to him than breathing. "Boss," Marco said carefully, "we can mobilize everyone. Hit them from 3 directions before they know what's happening." "Too risky," Dante replied, his mind already working through alternatives. "If they see us coming, they'll kill her immediately." Vincent's desperate enough to do it. "So what's the play?" Tommy asked. "The play is that Vincent Romano underestimated exactly who he's dealing with," Dante said grimly. "He thinks Zara is just some helpless woman I'm protecting. He has no idea what she's capable of. At the abandoned warehouse where Vincent had set up his operation, Zara forced herself to remain calm despite the zip ties cutting into her wrists and the gun pointed casually in her direction. She'd been in enough emergency situations to know that panic killed people faster than bullets, that survival depended on staying alert and looking for opportunities. The Romano soldiers clearly expected her to be crying or begging, seemed almost disappointed by her composed assessment of her surroundings. What they didn't understand was that 2 years of running from Devon had taught her to evaluate threats and escape routes as automatically as breathing. Vincent Romano himself was exactly what she'd expected: medium height, expensive suit, the kind of aggressive energy that suggested he'd fought for everything he'd ever gotten. When he crouched in front of her chair, she met his gaze directly, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. "You're calmer than I expected," he said with what might have been approval. "Screaming wouldn't improve my situation," she replied evenly. "Smart woman," Vincent agreed. "Too bad you picked the wrong man to fall in love with." "Did I?" she asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're the one who made the mistake." Vincent's expression darkened. "Your boyfriend has cost me millions in territory and contracts. Tonight, I get it all back, plus interest." "You're assuming he'll trade his family's legacy for one woman," Zara said. "That's a lot of faith to put in a relationship that's barely 2 weeks old." Something in Vincent's eyes suggested he'd considered the same possibility, that his entire plan hinged on Dante caring more about her life than his business interests. It was a gamble that revealed as much desperation as strategy. The warehouse door exploded inward at exactly 11:47, filling the space with smoke and confusion as Dante's people moved with military precision. But instead of the full assault Vincent had prepared for, only 3 figures emerged from the chaos. Dante himself, flanked by Marco and Tommy, all of them armed but not firing. Vincent grabbed Zara roughly, pressing his gun against her temple as his men scrambled to defensive positions. "I said come alone," he snarled. "I did," Dante replied calmly, his hands visible and empty. "These two are just here to witness the transfer." "What transfer?" Vincent demanded. "The transfer of everything you wanted," Dante said. "Shipping contracts, territory rights, protection arrangements, all of it. In exchange for her life." Zara felt her heart break as she realized what he was offering, how much he was willing to sacrifice for her. But she also noticed what Vincent's attention on Dante had missed: the small medical kit that had fallen from her purse when they'd grabbed her, the supplies she'd been carrying when they took her. "You're serious," Vincent said, his grip on her loosening slightly with surprise. "Dead serious," Dante confirmed. "But I want to see her walk out of here first. Then we'll discuss terms." Vincent's mistake was assuming that Zara would remain passive during their negotiation. As he gestured for one of his men to verify Dante's claims, she managed to work the zip ties loose enough to reach the medical kit with her fingertips. The scalpel inside was small but surgical sharp, designed for precision rather than force. When she moved, it was with the kind of desperate efficiency that 2 years of fear had taught her. The blade sliced through the zip ties and found Vincent's wrist in one continuous motion, severing tendons and causing him to drop his weapon with a scream of pain and shock. The gunfire that followed was brief but decisive. Dante's people had been positioned throughout the warehouse from the beginning, waiting for their moment to act without endangering Zara. Within seconds, Vincent's men were either dead or surrendering, their leader bleeding and cursing on the warehouse floor. Dante reached Zara before she'd fully processed what had happened, pulling her against his chest with a desperation that suggested he'd been as terrified as she had been. The feel of his arms around her, solid and warm and alive, made her knees go weak with relief. "You scared the hell out of me," he whispered against her hair. "You were going to give up everything," she replied, pulling back to look at him. "Your family's legacy, everything you've built. None of it matters without you," he said simply. "I love you, Zara. I love you and Amara both. And I'd burn it all down before I'd let anyone hurt either of you." The words hit her like a physical blow, not because they were unexpected, but because they carried the weight of absolute truth. This man, who commanded respect through power and fear, who'd built an empire on carefully calculated risks, had been willing to sacrifice everything for her. "I love you too," she whispered, the words feeling both foreign and completely natural on her lips. Their reunion was interrupted by the arrival of Boston PD, responding to reports of gunfire and finding a scene that Marco had carefully arranged to look like self-defense rather than a coordinated assault. Vincent Romano would face charges for kidnapping and assault, his organization crippled by the loss of leadership and key personnel. But it was the second call that night that provided the final resolution. Devin Matthews had been arrested attempting to flee the state with a trunk full of cash and what appeared to be detailed surveillance photos of Zara and Amara. The private investigator he'd hired had cooperated with authorities in exchange for reduced charges, providing evidence of stalking and violation of restraining orders that would keep Devin in prison for years. 3 days later, Dante was back in a hospital bed, this time at Massachusetts General with a bullet wound to his shoulder from the warehouse confrontation. Zara sat beside him in the chair that had become familiar, monitoring his vitals with the same professional competence she'd shown weeks earlier. But everything else had changed. "This is becoming a habit," she said as she checked his bandages. "Getting shot to impress you?" He replied with a grin that made her heart skip. "It's an inefficient courtship strategy. Especially since I was already impressed," she admitted. "The way you were willing to sacrifice everything for us. The way you trusted me to handle myself in that warehouse, that's not protection, Dante. That's partnership." The distinction mattered to both of them. The difference between being cared for and being controlled, between safety and possession. In his eyes, she saw the same recognition, the same understanding that what they'd built together was stronger than either of them had been alone. When Amara arrived with Isabella and Sophia an hour later, she climbed carefully onto Dante's uninjured side and announced that she'd drawn him a picture of their family. The crayon drawing showed 3 stick figures holding hands in front of a building that looked remarkably like his penthouse, with hearts floating around their heads and a sun smiling down from the corner. "That's us," she explained seriously. "Mama and me and you, all together." "All together," Dante agreed, his voice thick with emotion as he looked at this child who'd claimed him as naturally as breathing, who'd given him the family he'd never known he wanted. As evening approached and visiting hours ended, Zara prepared to leave with Amara to let Dante rest. But he caught her hand before she could go, his gray-green eyes serious in the dim hospital light. "When I get out of here, we need to talk about making this permanent," he said quietly. "About marriage and adoption papers, and building something that no one can ever take away from us." The certainty in his voice, the way he spoke of their future as something already decided, should have frightened her. Instead, it filled her with the kind of hope she'd thought was dead, the possibility that safety and love weren't mutually exclusive, that she could have both protection and partnership with the same person. "Yes," she said simply, the word carrying the weight of every dream she'd been afraid to voice. Outside the hospital windows, Boston sparkled with evening lights, and somewhere in the distance, church bells marked the hour. But inside the small room, 3 people who'd found each other against all odds began planning a future that none of them could have imagined just weeks before. 3 months after the warehouse confrontation, Zara stood in the kitchen of what was now officially their home, watching Dante help Amara with her homework at the Marble Island. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows caught the gold in her daughter's curls as she struggled with addition problems, her tongue poking out in concentration. Dante's patience with Amara's learning process never ceased to amaze Zara. This man who commanded respect through power and strategic thinking would spend 20 minutes explaining why 7 plus 5 equaled 12, using everything from cookies to building blocks until the concept finally clicked in Amara's mind. "I got it," Amara announced triumphantly, holding up her worksheet. 7 plus 5 is 12 because you take the 5 and count up 7 more numbers. "Perfect," Dante said, his smile genuine and proud. "You're getting really good at this." The domestic scene should have felt surreal after years of struggling alone, but instead it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Zara had officially moved into the penthouse 6 weeks earlier, bringing with her the few possessions that had survived their flight from Detroit and the hope that this time, building a home with someone wouldn't end in heartbreak. The transition hadn't been without challenges. Amara had needed time to adjust to having a father figure, had tested boundaries, and looked for signs that Dante might leave like her biological father had. But Dante's consistency, His genuine delight in her presence and his careful respect for her relationship with Zara had gradually won her over completely. Isabella had embraced her role as surrogate grandmother with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting years to spoil a child properly. She arrived twice a week with new books or art supplies or elaborate plans for teaching Amara to cook traditional Italian recipes. The relationship between them had developed into something precious and irreplaceable, filling a void in both their lives that neither had fully acknowledged before. Most surprisingly, Zara had found acceptance among the extended family that felt both overwhelming and deeply comforting. Sunday dinners had become a tradition that Amara looked forward to all week, filled with cousins to play with and relatives who competed to hear about her latest adventures. The warmth and inclusion had gradually healed places in Zara's heart she hadn't realized were still wounded. The decision to continue working at Boston Medical had been entirely hers, supported by Dante despite his initial instinct to provide for everything she might need. Her nursing career wasn't just about financial independence, though that remained important to her sense of self. It was about maintaining her identity as someone who saved lives, who contributed something meaningful to the world beyond her roles as girlfriend and mother. Dante had arranged for security that was so subtle she sometimes forgot it existed, protection that allowed her to move freely while ensuring that what had happened with Devin and Vincent Romano could never happen again. The balance between safety and freedom had taken time to negotiate, but they'd found a rhythm that respected both his need to protect and her need for autonomy. That evening, after Amara had fallen asleep clutching the new book Isabella had brought her, Dante led Zara out onto the terrace that overlooked Boston Harbor. The city sparkled below them like scattered diamonds, and she could smell the salt air mixing with the scent of early autumn flowers in the planters that Margaret tended with religious devotion. They stood together in comfortable silence for several minutes, Zara leaning back against Dante's chest as his arms encircled her from behind. These quiet moments had become precious to her, time when they could simply exist together without the demands of his business or her work or Amara's boundless energy. "I have something for you," he said finally, his voice carrying an undertone of nervousness that was rare for someone so accustomed to commanding situations. When she turned in his arms, she found him pulling a small velvet box from his jacket pocket, the traditional ring box that had probably launched 1,000 proposals. But instead of dropping to one knee in the grand gesture she might have expected, he simply held the box between them, his gray-green eyes serious in the evening light. "I know this is fast," he said quietly. "I know you have every reason to be careful about promises from men who claim to love you. But Zara, I can't imagine my life without you and Amara in it anymore." She opened the box with fingers that trembled slightly, revealing a ring that took her breath away. It wasn't the massive diamond solitaire that wealth might have dictated, but something far more thoughtful. 3 stones set in platinum, a deep blue sapphire flanked by 2 smaller diamonds, elegant and timeless without being ostentatious. "The sapphire is Amara's birthstone," he explained, watching her face carefully. "And the diamonds represent you and me, supporting what's most precious between us." The symbolism made her throat tight with emotion. This wasn't just a proposal, but a declaration that he understood what mattered most to her, that any future they built together would center around her daughter's happiness and security. "Dante Torino," she said softly, "are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking you to build a life with me," he replied. "To let me adopt Amara legally, to take my name and my protection and everything I can give you both. I'm asking you to trust me with the most precious things in your world." The tears that spilled down her cheeks were happy ones, born of relief and hope and the overwhelming rightness of his words. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, of course, yes." When he slipped the ring onto her finger, it fit perfectly, as if it had been designed specifically for her hand. When he kissed her, soft and reverent under the Boston stars, Zara felt the last of her carefully constructed walls crumble away, replaced by something infinitely stronger. Planning their wedding became a family affair that somehow managed to honor both their backgrounds without compromising either. Isabella threw herself into preparations with the joy of someone who'd been waiting decades to plan her son's wedding, while Sophia coordinated details with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing complex logistics. Zara had initially worried about cultural differences, about not being Italian enough for a family that valued tradition so highly. But Isabella had surprised her by insisting they incorporate elements that reflected Zara's heritage as well, wanting the ceremony to celebrate everything that had brought her future daughter-in-law to this moment. The venue they chose was perfect for what they wanted. The gardens at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, beautiful enough to satisfy Isabella's aesthetic standards while intimate enough to feel personal rather than showy. Late September in Boston meant the leaves were just beginning to turn, painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson that complemented the flowers they'd chosen. The morning of the wedding, Zara woke in the guest room at Isabella's house, where tradition dictated she spend her last night as a single woman. Amara was already awake beside her, practically vibrating with excitement about her role as flower girl and her new dress that made her feel like a princess. Have you ever noticed how love can completely rewrite your story when you least expect it? Sometimes the person who challenges everything you believe about yourself turns out to be exactly what your heart was searching for. Sophia appeared in the doorway with coffee and the kind of knowing smile that suggested she'd been listening to Isabella's preparations downstairs for hours. "Ma's been cooking since 4 in the morning," she reported with fond exasperation. "I think she's planning to feed half of Boston." "Is she nervous?" Zara asked, suddenly worried about meeting expectations she didn't fully understand. "She's ecstatic," Sophia assured her. "She's been waiting her whole life for this day, for Dante to find someone who makes him truly happy." As the morning progressed and the house filled with female relatives offering help with everything from hair to makeup to last-minute alterations, Zara found herself surrounded by the kind of loving chaos she'd only dreamed of during her solitary years in Detroit. This was what family felt like, she realized. People who claimed you completely and refused to let you face important moments alone. Isabella appeared in the doorway as Zara was putting the finishing touches on her makeup, wearing the kind of formal dress that suggested she'd been saving it for a special occasion. "You look beautiful," she said simply, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Like you belong in our family." She fastened a delicate gold chain around Zara's neck, a simple cross that had clearly been worn for decades. "This was Dante's grandmother's," she explained. "She came from Sicily with nothing but hope and determination. I think she would have loved you very much." The gift was more than jewelry. It was acceptance, inheritance, proof that she'd been claimed by people who understood the courage it took to build something lasting from nothing. The ceremony itself was everything Zara had dreamed of and nothing she could have planned alone. Amara walked down the garden path, scattering rose petals with the serious concentration of someone entrusted with an important job, her flower crown slightly askew and her smile bright enough to power the city. When Dante appeared at the altar in a charcoal suit that had clearly been tailored to perfection, Zara felt her breath catch in her throat. But it wasn't just his appearance that made her heart race. It was the expression on his face as he watched her approach, the mix of love and gratitude and wonder that suggested he couldn't quite believe this moment was real. The vows they'd written were simple but honest, promises to support each other's dreams and protect what they'd built together and love Amara as the precious gift she was. When Dante promised to be the father that Amara deserved and the husband that Zara needed, his voice thick with emotion, there wasn't a dry eye in the garden. The reception that followed was exactly what Isabella had envisioned. Abundant food, flowing wine, and dancing that continued long after the sun had set. Amara charmed every guest who would listen to her explanation of how families are made when people choose to love each other, her child's wisdom cutting straight to the heart of what they were celebrating. As the evening wound down and the last guests departed with full stomachs and happy hearts, Zara found herself dancing with her new husband in the garden that had witnessed their commitment. The string lights Isabella had insisted upon created a canopy of stars above them, and she could hear Amara's laughter from somewhere nearby, where she was being thoroughly spoiled by her new cousins. "How does it feel to be Mrs. Torino?" Dante asked, his arms around her waist as they swayed to music only they could hear. "Like coming home," she replied honestly. "Like everything that happened before was just preparing me for this moment." 1 year later, Zara stood in the same kitchen where this story had begun, but everything had changed in the most beautiful ways possible. Her hands rested on her rounded belly, feeling the subtle movements of the baby who would join their family in just a few months. Through the windows, She could see Amara in the garden with Dante, both of them dirty from planting flowers and laughing at some joke she couldn't hear. "Papa," Amara was saying, her voice carrying clearly through the open doors, "do you think the baby will like flowers too?" "I think the baby will like whatever makes you happy," Dante replied, lifting her up so she could reach the higher branches of the small tree they'd planted together. The sight of them together still made Zara's heart swell with gratitude for how completely Dante had embraced fatherhood. The adoption papers had been finalized 6 months after their wedding, making official what had been true from the moment Amara had decided he could stay. These days, she called him Papa without reservation, secure in the knowledge that he would always be there when she needed him. Dante's business had evolved over the past year, shifting toward more legitimate enterprises while maintaining the loyalty and respect that had always been his foundation. The dangerous elements hadn't disappeared entirely, but they no longer dominated their daily life, no longer created the constant tension that had marked their early days together. Isabella appeared in the kitchen carrying fresh herbs from her own garden, her face glowing with the contentment of someone whose family had grown exactly as she'd hoped. "How are you feeling, Kara?" she asked, using the endearment that had become natural between them. "Happy," Zara replied simply. "Tired, but happy." As if on cue, Amara burst through the terrace doors with Dante close behind, both of them covered in soil and grinning with the satisfaction of work well done. "Mama, we planted roses just like the ones at our wedding," Amara announced, climbing carefully onto a stool beside Zara. "Papa says they'll bloom when the baby comes." "Perfect timing," Zara agreed, smoothing her daughter's curly hair. Dante moved behind her, his hands joining hers on their growing child as he dropped a kiss on her temple. The simple domesticity of the moment, the absolute rightness of their small family in this space they'd made together, filled her with a contentment she'd never imagined possible. That evening, after Amara had fallen asleep clutching the new book Isabella had brought, and Isabella herself had departed with promises to return tomorrow with more cooking projects, Zara and Dante sat together on their terrace watching the sun set over Boston Harbor. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been?" she asked, her head pillowed on his shoulder. "Different how?" he replied, his fingers tracing gentle patterns on her arm. "If you'd stuck to your plan about only marrying Italian women," she said with a smile. "If I'd been too afraid to take the private duty job." Dante was quiet for a long moment, considering her question seriously. "I think we would have found each other eventually," he said finally. "Maybe not the same way, maybe not as quickly, but I believe some people are meant to be together." "Even if I had challenged everything you thought you wanted?" she asked. "Especially then," he replied. "You didn't just challenge what I thought I wanted, Zara. You showed me what I actually needed." As the lights began to twinkle across the city below them, as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky above, Zara reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the most unlikely encounters, with two people who seem to have nothing in common discovering that they have everything that matters. The baby kicked strongly against her ribs, as if responding to her thoughts about love and family and the beautiful, unexpected ways that life could surprise you. In a few months, their family would grow again. Their happiness would expand to include another small person who would be loved and protected and cherished by everyone who surrounded them. Love, real love, she had learned, wasn't about finding someone who fit your expectations. It was about finding someone who made you want to become the best version of yourself, someone who saw your potential and helped you reach it, someone who chose you again and again no matter what challenges arose. And as Dante's arms tightened around her, and their daughter slept safely in the next room, and their unborn child moved restlessly in her womb, Zara knew with absolute certainty that she had found that kind of love at last.